Um, our California meetup with soccer Hall of Famer Brandy Chastain was unbelievable. The Florida meetup, I guess, was a huge success. We've got our next meetup at the US Open on August 30th. If you want to join us for that, our retreat is set for the Weekapaug Inn, the #1 hotel in the Northeast, top 100 in the world. It's called Living with Legends, and you'll be spending those 4 days with Mace Curran, the second woman to ever fly lead solo for the Thunderbirds, Robert Hamilton Owens, who I think is the most interesting man in the world, Joe Jacoby, Olympic gold medalist, Megan Riley from Shark Tank, and Jackie Summers, who has the world's #1 most awarded liqueur. And we did figure out a way to do a 12-month payment with no financing. So if you're interested in the retreat, we do have a few spots left. Let us know. And then just a huge thank you. So Outlier Magazine, our second issue came out with Jacques Pepin on the cover. And we are now over 21,000 subscribers. So on our way to 100,000 subscribers. So we're really excited about that. For anyone who has never been on a Legend Series call before, let me just tell you what the format is. So Mick and I are going to talk for about 30 minutes, like a fireside chat. I've got a bunch of questions for him. Then we open it up for live Q&A. So all you have to do is put in the chat that you've got a question for Michael, and we'll tee you up, and you can ask your question directly to him. So I am unbelievably excited for this. And I have been since the first time that we spoke, thanks to a mutual friend, Kara Golden, who introduced us a while back. But for anyone who does not know, he has spent the last decade plus leading Global Citizen, where he's one of the 4 co-founders, influencing and implementing change all over the world. He oversees a global team that secures and tracks over $60 billion to end extreme poverty. He is the author of this absolutely killer book, From Ideas to Impact, which is a playbook for implementing change in a divided world. And he has worked on campaigns with world leaders and artists that include Beyonce, Coldplay, Rihanna, Usher, Miley Cyrus, like on and on and on. It's literally a who's who, and their festivals are legendary. So I am incredibly excited for this conversation. So before we get started, Kathy, get us going. Mick, we're not screwing around with those introductions. What do you think?
I thought it was incredible. I don't think I've ever done a virtual talk yet with an introduction as cool and awesome as that one. It's super cool.
Well, that was thanks to Mr. Perlo at Perlo Productions. So thank you for joining us. I'm fired up for this conversation. So thanks for carving out the time for us.
No, it's my pleasure. And I'm literally, just so you know where I'm speaking to you from, I'm literally here in Salt Lake City. Got in late last night with we have an 8-month-old baby. We have my wife, we have my in-laws. And the great thing about this book tour is being able to see a lot of America and other parts of the world. And we're staying with a friend who has an abandoned church that they've converted into a house. And
How
so
cool
that's
is
where I'm
that?
speaking to you from this morning here in, actually, I'm not in Salt Lake City. I'm actually in Park City. But yeah, really, really amazing and excited to be on with you all.
I love, 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 love Park City. So yeah, fired up to have you. And so I have a million questions for you, but I'm going to take you back to when you were younger. So you grew up, you didn't really think of yourself as an athlete. I don't think you thought of yourself as an academic, but I think his name was Mr. Burns. You wrote an essay on a movie, Gladiator,
Yeah.
and I think it's kind of what happened after you wrote that
Yeah.
essay that changed your mindset a little bit. So I'd love for you to share that story to get us started.
Yeah, no, really happy to. I started high school, so I grew up in Perth, Western Australia, which even though it's the most isolated city in the world and it's very far to get to, it's also one of the most beautiful places in the world, and I highly recommend it if anyone ever gets the chance to visit. But one thing about Australia is we idolize sports. Like we put sports on a pedestal, and all the motivational speakers are always sporting heroes. And so if you're like me, that couldn't kick a ball in a straight line and was always petrified of all the other kids laughing at me, you already didn't have much self-esteem going into high school. And then on top of that, as you said, I also wasn't academically that gifted either. I still remember that teacher, Mr. Byrne, who was 24, it was his first teaching gig, walking my mum through where I was ranked in the class and saying, if Michael continues where he is, he's already bottom of the class. He's not even going to finish high school, let alone get into university, college, all of these wonderful things. And to be honest, I didn't think much of it. One of my best friends later on in life says that sometimes when people set so low expectations of you, you tend to live down to those expectations rather than rise above to meet above it. I'd be getting home, playing PlayStation, whatever, no ounce of aspiration. And as you said, one day, got home from school. My mom had this weird, confused look on her face, and she said, "There's a message for you on the answer machine," and it was from Mr. Byrne, and went something like this: "Hi, Mrs. Sheldrick. I've noticed a change in Michael. Can you give me a call back?" And I thought that's a kind of strange, creepy message. What have I done wrong? What am I in trouble for? And Mr. Burns said, Michael somehow topped the class in this essay, and we know he didn't cheat because you walked in, you could write on anything. And I loved the movie Gladiator. One thing I always loved was history, and that movie with Russell Crowe had just come out, and I just poured my passion into Roman gladiators and got home. And yeah, he said you topped the class. And the next day, I go in, and he goes, you know, I think there's more to you than meets the eye. You may not believe in yourself, but I believe in you. And he challenged me. And it was the first time anyone had really challenged me. He said, I think if you are willing to work halfway, I'll meet you in the middle. Recess, school, after school, lunch, whatever it is, I'll work with you in extra hours. And I believe you can be number one by the end of the year in the whole class. So sure enough, but what the heck? And my mum still is like, wow, after years of people saying Michael's stupid, lazy, is a loser, not going to amount to anything. Let's give this a go. And sure enough, second last day of school, there on my couch at home, and this car pulls up the driveway, and out jumps Mr. Byrne. And he says, I've just been crunching, doing final markings, and I couldn't wait until tomorrow. And in a very Australian way, outstretches his hand and he goes, well done, mate. Well done. And he gives me this certificate with a number one. And of course, Aspiration Unleashed, I was like, wow, heck, this really works. If you when people say you get out what you put in, wow, there's something here if you have the opportunity to put something in. And I guess years later, I finished high school, top 1% of the state, got into law school. Suddenly people's like, wow, you're so intelligent, you're so inspiring. And I'm like, well, no, because I still remember what it was like being that kid at the start of high school. And I still remember the difference Mr. Byrne made in my life. And really, that was a change. That was a fork in the road. And I guess just as I learned at high school about all of the injustices in the world, that there were millions of children around the world, maybe because they don't have access to a great teacher like Mr. Byrne or some other injustice, would never be able to achieve their full potential. And so for me, I guess really my work in terms of starting Global Citizen and that journey really began out of a sense of gratitude. It was a sense of gratitude for the opportunities I had and a sense that everyone should have access to those same opportunities. And yeah, that's what led me start of high school, getting involved, and one thing led to the other.
I love it. I think there's an undercurrent that I hear all the time, that charity starts at home. Um, and I think sometimes people think maybe even extreme poverty, well, that's not maybe, the people that are around me. So it's it can be challenging, I think, for people to think globally. And I remember we had the actress who's now a conservationist, Shannon Elizabeth, come on. And so she lives in South Africa with her husband, Simon. And what was fascinating is she was talking about, rhino poaching. And, I think for
Mm,
most people, it's like, oh, okay, most of us are in the United States. And, that seems a world away. And why would we donate money or time? But they actually did a great job of tying that rhino horn trade to terrorism, and it made it seem like something that was less, far away. How do that's got to be something that you deal with on a regular
yeah, yeah.
basis. What do you say when people, have that mindset that charity starts at home?
Yeah, so my retort to that is often, look, charity might begin at home, but it doesn't end at home. And in Australia, one thing that we are seeing, it, close to as I was finishing high school, in my last year, there was the Boxing Day tsunami, which killed, thousands of people. I mean, it was horrific. And Australians really dug deep. It was one of the most generous nations I've ever seen in terms of at that moment. And the government stepped forward. I think there was a surge in development humanitarian aid. And part of the reason is because many Australians were also involved, right? They were in amongst these communities. Australians were killed in the tsunamis. And I think many Australians actually saw the impact this had on the communities around them, but also saw how grateful they were for the opportunities they had in Australia, access to health and education. So there was something in the national psyche after the Boxing Day tsunami that hit many parts of Southeast Asia that really, I think, changed the psyche and it really brought it home. I mean, many Australian families were impacted by it. And then I was able to say, look, we're impacted. What about these other communities? And it really showed people that actually these communities are not as far as away as we think. We tend to think they're on a far off distant land, but actually they're so close to home. And I think that really triggered the start of this conversation that, whether you're doing it because in our backyard, we have a whole Southeast Asia, we have the Pacific nations, nations, incredible cultures, which Australians, naturally over time through our traveling, through our backpacking, we've got to know and we've got to spend time with and we can relate to. And I think, we want a prosperous, we want a safe and secure neighborhood, so to speak, because, if these nations succeed, at the end of the day, they become destinations for Australian goods and services, tourism, etc. And we see that also flow back into Australia. One of the largest exports in Australia, people tend to think of Australia as being this great big mining community, right? And yes, mining, natural gas, iron ore, now lithium, that's really our bread and butter, right? And that's how Australia has become very prosperous. But the second biggest export is actually education, right? Australia has become tremendously wealthy by exporting education and welcoming people predominantly from Asia to our country. And that's only possible if people are able to lift themselves out of poverty in order for them to get an education. So Australia, I would say our prosperity in recent years, I mean, we've become one of the wealthiest countries in the world, is intimately tied to the end of extreme poverty. And then I would also say there's just the moral reasons. I mean, when people say, do you have to volunteer in communities to feel to relate, to feel the sense that this is an injustice that we should contribute. The reason why I tell my story is I had never really left Perth, Western Australia. Mm-hmm. I had never really explored the region. And yet, as I became aware, it was like, wow, okay, this is an injustice. And morally, you know, we tend to think of development assistance, you know, investing in hospitals and investing in schools. You know, sometimes the media blow it out and they like make it think that there's so much money that's being spent overseas and not being spent on Australia. But what I say is like, only 0.7% of the entire Australian budget actually goes towards these development initiatives. That means 99.3% of our budget is spent at home in Australia. And yet for that 0.7%, in terms of bang for buck and the impact, it's huge. You know, it's eradicating disease, it's providing education, and you would be hard pressed to find another area of government expenditure which is having such a tremendous impact in our region.
You know, we live in such a divided world, and it's literally on the cover of your book, which is fantastic. And you know, we need coalition builders, and you're a coalition builder. How do we do that in order to come together?
You know, in the book, I outline 8 steps, and I call it policy entrepreneurship, right? Because I was like, there's many ways people can make a difference. And that global citizen, we really came about because we saw that yes, you can donate to charity. Yes, you can volunteer your time. Yes, you can register to vote. Yes, you can have conversations about the biggest issues of the day. And yet when people wake up in the morning and they say, I want to make a difference, I want to contribute to improving people's lives, very rarely do we think policy change. It sounds wonky, it sounds abstract, and also like it just sounds so inaccessible. It sounds like it's something that should be reserved for government. And yet, when you look at systemic challenges like extreme poverty, no amount of gala night dinners or charity quiz nights is going to raise the billions needed to end extreme poverty. You just can't do it. It's a systemic challenge, and systemic challenges require systemic solutions. So at Global Citizen, the way how we decided to get involved and address this is we were at university, and it was right on the cusp of social media, and we combined social media with popular culture with the power of music. We called it Pop and Policy, and we used the power of popular culture to really mainstream these issues, get people involved, and give them a way to take action. Because I genuinely believe that the best antidote to apathy and indifference is action. But that was just our model. We leveraged the power of popular culture, and Global Citizen is well known. And if any of you are in New York, we have our upcoming Global Citizen Festival, September 28th, which is going to be huge, and invite you all along. But the point I make in the book is that that's just one example, right? We can also leverage other platforms. We can leverage the strengths of others. I still remember in 2018 when we were invited by the family of Nelson Mandela to put on what would have been the campaign to mark 100 years since the birth of Nelson Mandela. We had Jay-Z, Beyonce, Oprah Winfrey, Ed Sheeran, all these incredible artists that we announced. And I still remember how when we announced this campaign, Mandela 100 was trending. Beyonce was trending, of course, in South Africa. And then there was this hashtag, It's Bloody Time. And I looked into this hashtag, where it was coming from. And it was these incredible young women who were basically taking it upon themselves to say it's an outrage that in modern South Africa, because of period poverty, when girls can't access sanitary pads and napkins, that up to some girls lose up to 60 days of school a year because they can't access period products. And when they get their periods, they have to drop out out of school. And these young advocates, and I love it because one of these young advocates, she literally described herself and introduced herself to me as the minister of menstruation. She said, if government's not going to do it, if no one else is going to do it, then heck, I'm going to just take in and I'm going to seize that role and I'm going to make myself the minister. And sure enough, she hijacked our platform. And by hijack, we were happy for that. We thought, well, this is great. And since that campaign 6 years later, as a result, and I have a chapter dedicated to this in the book, I think more than 4 million girls now have access to period products that didn't. But the reason why I love that example is sometimes there's a sense that we have to go out and we have to create the wheel, right? And you asked me, how do we work together in divided times? It's about building community. And often if you have a powerful idea, if you have a sense of the injustice you're trying to change and the impact you're trying to create, well, part of being a policy entrepreneur is to look around and say, well, what are my strengths? What are my shortfalls? And how can I leverage and ask others to use their platforms rather than to build it myself? And I think, one of the things I've been speaking to at college campuses, I was at Columbia University the day the police came in and there was the solidarity encampments. The next week I was at NYU, and I would say 85–90% of student groups I've been speaking to are actually yearning for this idea, like beyond the anger, beyond the protesting, how do we build lasting change? And one of the things I say to people is, yes, when you reach out and you ask others to use their platforms or you ask for help, you might be surprised by those who say no. You might be surprised by those who never get back to you and ignore you. But generally speaking, you will be surprised by who does reply to you. And the thing that will surprise you is just the amount of people that will rally behind. And that's because I think in a world in which people are searching for answers, in a world in which people exercise this degree of anxiety and lack of agency and apathy, if you can show them solutions, people will rally behind it because that's the most powerful magnet. And so I talk about in the book the power of boldly, naively audacious goals, which I think we need more than ever. And the good thing is good ideas can come from anywhere. And I've got many other stories as well, stories of community builders who managed to get billions of dollars to restore America's forests. I interviewed those campaigners that in America's cities, one thing I didn't know is that in poorer neighborhoods of America, particularly in urban environments, if you're in poorer communities, chances are you have less trees and wealthier neighborhoods. And if you've got extreme heat, if you've got extreme temperatures, then that cement jungle is going to make it even more incredibly hot. And just how these communities came together in order to get funding, in order to restore forests across these cities. They called it tree equity. And I'll finish on this story because I asked one of the campaigners, I said, well, what was the secret? Because 15 years ago, you said you were all fighting amongst yourselves. And he said, look, we went out and I invited, he goes, I organized a retreat. In fact, he said it was more like a sleepover, right? Which is kind of funny when you think of activists. And he said, I invited some of the crazy left-leaning ones. And then I invited some of the right-wing ones over here, those who wouldn't even utter the words climate change. And I brought us all together. And when we walked up there, the coolest thing is we walked up there as the most diverse movement ever assembled in the history of environmental activism in America. And together they're changing cities and planting trees across America.
So cool. And I love what you guys have done by leveraging popular culture to move beyond the already converted, because I think, in many cases, people are preaching to the choir, and in order for us to
Yeah.
really make significant change, we have to, move beyond those people that are already converted. And you guys have used, popular culture, I think, brilliantly to do that. What's the biggest challenge that you face, running a nonprofit?
I think just on that notion which you mentioned, one of the biggest challenges for us was actually trying to find, well, what is our niche, right? Who are we actually trying to engage and who's our audience? And when we first started Global Citizen, this is going back 15 years ago, our initial product, if you like, was we developed a 90-minute presentation and was like, we're going to explain people what extreme poverty is and how we can address it. And we're going to give them ways in which they can make an impact. And we went to, community groups, workplaces, faith groups, schools, universities. And at the end of like an 18-month period, we had reached 150,000 people. And on the one hand, that's great, 150,000. But as you got down to it, to your point, all of the people that came were already highly engaged. If you're doing a lunchtime seminar, if you're doing a faith community, if you're speaking at a school, often it was those schools that already had social justice programs, right? And then when we looked back to it, it was like, well, what was the actual impact? What did we create? And that's really where we decided, listen, if we're going to be real, we need to mainstream these issues. We need to not just reach hundreds of thousands, we need to reach millions of people. And in order to do that, we recognized we had to build a platform. And our biggest challenge was the fact, like, now you look at us and you're like, Global Citizen is doing these incredible events. You're doing these big productions. We work with some of the biggest artists in the world. Chris Martin of Coldplay is the curator of the international edition of the Global Citizen Festival. We've taken it around the world. We have 12 million citizen advocates. And yet when we started, we had none of that. We didn't know anyone. And all we had was the power of our ideas. And what I found was when you had very clear, boldly, naively audacious ideas, right? And we put it out there and we spoke to people, what I found is that very quickly, and I should say I was not an events guy. I still remember being daunted by our first campaign when we said we was going to do this, our very first music concert. I had this memory of trying to do an event at my university. In Australia, we call barbecue sausage sizzles. Literally simple. It's literally a sausage on a barbecue with a slice of bread and some tomato sauce on it. Somehow I messed that up, and I still remember having memories of 50 people coming, seeing these cold sausages on the barbecue and promptly walking away. So I was not an events guy. And yet what I found is, like, when we went out there, I recall this memory, and actually part of the reason I'm in Utah was because the person that replied was this woman from Salt Lake City. And she had just married an Australian. They met surfing in Hawaii. She had moved out to Australia. She was bored. And one thing she had done in America was benefit concerts. And I remember I spoke to her and she said, do you have any artists signed? I was like, my friend's dad said that 10 years ago he met Bon Jovi backstage at a concert. Might remember him. Okay, so no artists. Do you have sponsorship? The local restaurant around the street has said that they will give free meals to all the volunteers on the day. She's like, okay, what team do you really have? And I was like, some volunteers I recruited from university. And she was like, do you even have enough money to pay me? And I was like, look, I'll be honest. We don't really have anything here, but will you help us? And she rang me back and she said she was turning down these offers if I promised her that if we did all of this, we would really generate impact. And I said yes. And 6 months later, we had our very first concert. She managed to convince MTV to come on board. Some of the Redstone as well supported that. And we managed to convince John Legend to fly all the way to Australia. He spent more time flying than he was on the ground. And 9 months after that, after people saw that, we got outreach from America, from New York. They said, this is great how you're combining popular culture. And we found ourselves on the Great Lawn of Central Park. That was September 2012. It was my last year of university for what was the first Global Citizen Festival. And we had Neil Young, the Foo Fighters, and many others as well. And so I said, the challenge is, okay, we knew what we could do. It was being very clear and precise. And the reason why I say that is I find it sounds obvious, but the very first pillar in the book is to know your goal. And I use the SMART criteria and I talk that through because I find when people reach out to me now on Instagram, on LinkedIn, on social media, one of the biggest flaws I often find is that they're always talking about the problem. They might have mobilized some money and they're talking about maybe plastics in the ocean, illegal deforestation here. And yet in the absence of clear solutions, eventually you're going to burn your supporters out because all you're really doing is raising awareness around the problem. And one thing early on, at Global Citizen, as me and the other co-founders, we decided to ban the phrase awareness raising. And we said, let's hold ourselves accountable. And if we find ourselves just raising awareness around a problem and not actually driving real impact, then we have an issue and we're not being true to our mission. And I find that again and again. So it's really important. But I tell people, if you have that, if you have a very clear idea, then it's all just about networking. It's all about building coalitions. But if you don't have that idea, no amount of networking is going to help you.
You know, we live in such a cynical world, and there's so many things going on that are, you know, could be perceived as very negative. How do you maintain your level of optimism just from day to day to do what you do?
You know, it's a good question. In the book, I've been fortunate enough to work with and really interviewed. When I was putting together, and the book isn't just about Global Citizen. It was really my study into what contributes to policy entrepreneurship, because my view was we needed more individuals involved, and in the same way that entrepreneurs disrupt traditional businesses by coming up with interesting products that meet a need and then bring in new unconventional ways to sell those products. I was like, it's the same for the solutions to some of our biggest systemic challenges in the world. And so I really had the opportunity to interview and try and distill what was the key principles of success by speaking to some of these incredible policy entrepreneurs. And I met with workers groups in coal communities in Australia that was shifting from coal to renewable and really embracing this transition, driving new jobs, driving new investments, driving new businesses in this town, which had really just been a singular focused economy for more than a century. I met with leaders of communities in vulnerable situations, like Prime Minister Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, who, as a country, you'd have to go 360 cities down all the way to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, to find a city with the same economy the size of Barbados. So it's really not necessarily one of the most influential countries in the world. And yet she had found a way to shape the agenda and unlock resources for countries like hers, which were on the front lines of hurricanes. And she was saying, listen, let's put aside all the dogma. Let's put aside the anger and let's go out and drive real change. And so I guess, what gives me hope is that beneath the radar, there are these entrepreneurs who are building coalition, often deploying pragmatism, and I talk about pragmatic idealism in the book, who are bringing about the change. And we may not see it, but it's happening there beneath the surface. And I think that one of the principles in the book, it's the last principle that I often talk about, is to share stories of success. And I often think we don't do that enough. I think, on social media, and we've been guilty of this as well, but advocacy organizations, other nonprofits, too often we engage in talking about how bad the world is getting, right? And there's legitimate reasons to do that. But there was a study I looked at as part of the book. It was an NYU study. They surveyed 60,000 people across 60 countries. And what they found is that if you wanted people to share content on climate change, the best thing you could do was to put out a negative piece on social media, and that would get the most engagement. But the negative side of that is the same people, when you polled them, their belief in their ability to make a difference went down as they were sharing that content. In contrast, if you got people to write a letter to a future generation member, like a child born in 2055, who will be dealing with the consequences of the actions that we're taking today, and you had people write down what they were actually doing to contribute, that had a positive impact on their belief that they could make a difference. We can make a difference because we have made a difference. And in a world in which we don't trust social media, in which we don't trust what's given to us on the media, we often look to our friends and family, and our friends and family are often the best source of information. And if we see them making a difference, if we see the response that they're getting to their action, that's going to trigger us. And of course, we have to know where to begin, and that's where the book aims to give people a guide on where to get started so you can trigger that momentum. As Eleanor Roosevelt said, the best way to begin is to begin. But I
The
truly
magnet on your
believe
refrigerator, right?
that's right. I have it on. It was one of the first quotes. But look, I'll finish on this. There was I say this towards the end of the book. There was a gentleman who I overheard or interviewed or was speaking to in the course of finishing up this book. And he said, you know, I think it was his 6 or 7 year old child said to him, Dad, I'm seeing all the bad news in the world. I'm seeing all the negativity. And this child said, are we going to be okay? Are we actually going to be okay? And this is something that I recently became a father, and speaking to other new dads out there and others with maybe kids 10 years older, one thing they talk about is how their kids are actually saying, am I actually going to be okay? Are we actually going to be better off than our parents had it, right? And it's something you hear about a lot. And he turned around and he said, you know, one way to look at it, we don't know how the world is going to turn out. No one is a prophet. No one can predict the future. But one thing is if you want to live a profoundly meaningful life and make a difference in the lives of others, then you've been born at the right time. And through the unique randomness of being born right now, as a result of our actions that we take today, people born in 5, in 15 years, in 50 years' time will be impacted as a result. And so there has never been a greater time than in the whole history of humanity, us as individuals with the tools in front of us to make a profound difference in the lives of others. And I think that's something we have to hold on. And it's that, I guess, glass half full that gives me a strong sense of optimism that there's still a lot worth fighting for, as Jane Goodall says, and we still have a lot that we can contribute to and change.
I love that perspective. Mick, you ready to take some questions?
Absolutely.
All
And
right.
apologies, if there was any questions in the chat I missed along the way, I'll try
No,
and read. Yeah.
we'll they'll fire them at you. So we're going to Nicaragua first. So we as a community support one of our members, Peter Shaler, who runs a nonprofit in Nicaragua called Rayo de Sol. And so Peter Shaler, you're up first from Nicaragua.
All right, thank you. Nick, that was great. I really appreciate your sharing this time with us, and I'm really excited to read your book. This is going to be a little tricky because I probably got about 10 questions rolled into one. So I've been working in international development for the past 25 years or so. I'll see if I can be a little bit concise. So at the beginning, you were talking about, how do you get people to take that leap from being concerned with local issues to thinking about things internationally. And the only really way to do that is by creating empathy in people. I don't think everybody is necessarily born with a sufficient dose of empathy, but it's a learned behavior. So I'm just curious if in Global Citizen, that's an element of your work, is trying to stimulate and promote empathy in people. And then just to tag a question along to that, I'm also curious about how you select where you make investments. At our organization, we changed our language several years ago to encourage our donors to invest, not to make donations or charitable charitable giving. We use the word investment. And the truth of it is, and a lot of people on the call might not know this, I'm sure you do, that most development projects fail. The vast majority of development projects fail. I'm surrounded by failed development projects, abandoned infrastructure, training programs that lets in. So I'm just curious about your criteria when you select, beneficiaries, organizations, that might be doing local works. How you can't guarantee success, obviously, but what's your formula for refining your investment strategy to assure that the highest rate of success possible?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. On the first question around the extension of empathy and how do you get people to care, I think, we recognized early on that, one of my co-founders, he was motivated by his faith. He went and spent a year in Mother Teresa's school, and he said, I'm going to dedicate my whole life to this issue, right? Great. Good, good for him. Most people aren't like that. And for the vast majority of people out there, that image of, the person doing this, and they're also repenting the whole time, and the fact that to make a difference often comes at great personal sacrifice. The vast majority of society aren't like that, right? Many people want to make a difference, but they also want to watch sport at the same time. They want to listen to their favorite bands, the music. They want to engage in culture. And I do think there's a yearning to also interact. People want community as well. And so for us at Global Citizen, it was really really the recognition that where do we meet our audiences where they're at, and then bring them along on the journey, rather than getting all angry and saying, why doesn't 99% of the population think the way we do? Why isn't 99% of the population willing to, I guess, give up their day jobs, volunteer overseas, or give away all of their money? And so it's really that sense, with Global Citizen was, yeah, like we can bring people along. People want to be rewarded. They love being thanked for their efforts. And that's if we can give them a ticket to a great show, but we also want to give them a pathway to take action. And what's really cool now with Global Citizen is having this movement for the better part of a decade and a half, is I've now met high school students. So I've met university students who got engaged in their early years of high school, did their school projects on the issues because of what they found on Global Citizen. And now this is shaping the vocations that they pursue through university. So I do think it's possible to give people that broader perspective, but build in platforms where they're at. I still remember being in Glasgow a few years ago for the big climate talks. And there was these two activists in front of me, because there was a long line of people who were having this fight or argument. And one was saying, this is crazy. We're here, we're literally competing for the same space, the same interviews, and the same audiences. And what happened? When we got into the conference center, there were all of these panel discussions. There were like maybe one person in the audience for each of them. And this other activist said, that's why we should be building platforms. That's why we should be reaching people where we are. Going to Rotary clubs, going to community groups, investing in e-games, and meeting people where they're at. And that really reinforced to me about the work we do at Global Citizen. I think the second question, your idea of investing, where do we decide? And I talk about this in the book as well. Well, that image that the advocate, right, has to be staffed of resources, or to make a difference, you have to give up all of these sacrifices. I would say that image actually acts as a handbrake on philanthropic investment in much of the big systemic groundbreaking work. And what I mean by that, and Dan Pallotta talks about this in his book, The Uncharitable Myth, right? He talks about the myth of the overhead, the idea that investing in salaries, investing in marketing, even if it has all this high return, isn't something that people should be engaging in. And really, the point I make in the book is that people who are engaging in policy, entrepreneurs, citizen advocates, and let's be clear, citizen-led advocacy is key to delivery. You can have all the money in the world, but unless you have accountability, right, citizen-led accountability, you're not going to drive real change. And so my challenge to philanthropy has been, if you really care about systemic change, invest in the capacity of nonprofits to genuinely pursue policy entrepreneurship, and don't try and invest in these gotcha moments. Don't try and give, bad, old formulaic ways of measuring impact, but come together in partnership. And when I say invest in capacity, that's often the human potential of people as well, because that stigma is still out there, and it needs to be addressed in much the same way we value teachers, we value nurses, we value doctors. We should be valuing those entrepreneurs who are driving change as well. So, and for philanthropy, if you really want to act as a force multiplier and leverage your influence, then this is one great way to do that. And I've written about this in other spaces. I've written several articles every given Tuesday on my Forbes.com column, but it's something I'm really passionate is how do we change the mindset of philanthropy.
I would love to connect with you directly. I will, excuse me, and send you a message after this. If there are a couple minutes at the end, I will ask one more question, but I will succeed right now to others that might want to have questions as well.
Thanks, Peter. We're going to California. Amy, you're up.
All right, thank you. Michael, it's so good to listen to you. As someone who studied and was involved in international development a long time ago, I'm really curious, what was, and it still continues to be possibly most surprising about entering this world, and what, what did you think was going to happen? What was really different? And what would you like to change?
How I got involved. So I mentioned the story right at the start, how, I recognized that this was something I wanted to contribute to, grateful for the opportunities I had in Australia. Like many people on this call, and, like the question, we tended to think about charity, not investment. And what I found is many people who are involved in this space often go through a similar process, right? Thinking this is about charity, and then you're like, wait, this is more systemic. And so what did I do? Well, I thought, okay, if this is about extended school opportunities, let's build schools, right? This was 2006. I didn't have many superpowers, as you heard. In events, academic, and sports, my strengths were few and far between. But one thing which I did find I was good at was shamelessly asking people to give stuff away for free. And so I went to my local supermarket. I went to like McDonald's, the equivalent of Starbucks, and I just asked for anything. I said, listen, I'm going to organize a quiz night at my old school. Will you chip in? Will you contribute all this stuff? And we did all these raffles. We did this quiz night. This was the first thing I ever did. And we raised about $1,000, which we donated to build this school, right? And of course, we went over and we looked at this school, and in some ways it's great. Oh, these bricks, this happened because of our donations. And then I was like, well, hold on a sec. Who's paying the teacher's salary? Who's paying those teachers' salaries 365 days a year? Who's paying to put the meals on the table at lunchtime? Because for many of these children, that's the only healthy, nutritious meal they will get. And then if their parents get sick or something else happens, tragedy, where is the social safety net? Where is the healthcare system? And then when you apply this to every single community, that's where I was like, wow, okay, this isn't about charity, because I could be the best fundraiser in the world. I could raise millions of dollars in a year, and it's a drop in the ocean, because the UN estimate that it's going to cost about $100 billion a year to end extreme poverty. And for me, that's where I got interested in, well, what is systemic change? And then how do we actually shift policy, galvanize politicians? Because if politicians are, licking their finger, putting it out in the wind, looking at which way the wind is blowing, how do we direct this and say, listen, there's a visible constituency of support? So that was, for me, the biggest shift that really took place. And it was something that really struck a chord with me when I discovered at the same time this speech from Nelson Mandela in 2005. He said, ending extreme poverty is not an act of charity, it's an act of justice. Poverty is man-made, and it can be eradicated by the actions of human beings.
So good. Actually, it was one of the questions that I was going to ask you. So I knew that you're very good at asking for stuff, which is so important, because you don't get what you don't ask for. Why is it easy for you? Is it because you have a strong why, or you just are innately good at it? And any advice for people, because we all have to ask for certain things and advocate for causes and things that are important for us. Any advice?
Yeah, in the book, I talked about two types of stories. the stories of why and the stories of how. The story of why is so important, and I've seen this again and again, this mistake, and sometimes it baffles me because I'll be in these meetings, and sometimes it might be CEOs of very large organizations, big senior nonprofit leaders, and having fought tooth and nail to get in the room with some powerful person, someone who has the ability to make happen what they want happen. Often what happens is it's like they get in the room, they know they've got a limited amount of time with this person, and rather than trying to build a lasting connection, it's almost like they say, okay, I don't know if I'm going to have this opportunity again. And they just throw the entire textbook at this person for their issue. They load it up on stats, on arguments, on debates. They preempt every argument, even when the person opposite hasn't even asked a question, and because they make assumptions. And you can see it. It's a real shame sometimes, because you can see the person opposite, their eyes glaze over. And you know that when they walk out of it, they're going to say to their advisor or their staff, make sure that person never meets with me again. And there's a story I like to use in Australia. So we also have a Speaker of the House position, and the person who occupied this position, Speaker of the House, about 10 years ago, she was this really, I mean, she was known in her own political beliefs. She was on the fairly right of the spectrum, but she was also fairly conservative. I use a small non-political conservative sense, in that she had very old-fashioned views about society, about the role of children. You know, she was very strict. You know, she did appear like the headmistress, right, at the school. And I realized, meeting with her in a few minutes, I was like, I'm not making a connection here. There's no way I'm going to walk out here having her engaged in these issues. So how can I turn this around? And I decided to share my story of why, because I was like, maybe I can get her to understand. She doesn't trust why I'm here. She thinks I'm some student activist. She's like, what are you doing here? We have nothing in common. She's already made preconceived assumptions about who I am, who my ideology is, who I vote for. And so I just decided I said, I switched tact, and I told a story about maybe I should have begun with why I'm here. Let me tell the story. And I told a story about being bullied at high school, and I told a story about how it enabled me to then find my own calling. And suddenly I just noticed the mood shift. And there was a moment where her immediate reply was, no, Michael, you know, one thing about your story that you were too optimistic about is kids are cruel, and they'll always be bullying left to their own devices. That's why society needs to mold and shape them and bash them into civilized kids. And so she did make that comment, but after that, I can tell you how it ended. She said, really appreciate the time. The meeting went on, and she said, I'm going to write a note to the Prime Minister right now in support of your campaign and ask him to support everything you're calling for, which she subsequently did. And so those stories are so important. And again, a lot of this sounds cliched, but sometimes I think it seems so obvious that people just don't do it because I don't know, they think it's so obvious. But story of why, your own motivation, and then a story of how, right? Especially now, people get inundated with problems, and the last thing someone wants is another lecture about how bad the world is, why it's their fault. Tell them how, and chances are, if you walk in there, I had a meeting with this minister from Norway back in January. And after the meeting, I thought it was an okay meeting. I walked out there, I went in with my list. These are some ideas where we could partner together. And she turned around and she said, wow, this is the most uplifting meeting I've had all day, because you've walked in and these are actually concrete things we can do together. And the thing she said, and I tell people again and again, when you go in, don't just ask for something, but try and approach us in the spirit of partnership. What can you give in? What are you willing to do? If you're asking for someone to do something, then you also have to support as well. And that can be very basic. Years ago, I ended up, and I talk about this in the book, but I ended up being a pseudo diplomat of the Maltese government, having pitched the Prime Minister on this idea and this campaign. And when I realized that they had very little staff capacity, I was like, I'll end up writing the speeches, the talking points, the invites, all of these things, and meet them halfway if this means we can work together. So I think approaching it in the spirit of partnership, whoever it is.
Fantastic. Paul in Florida, you're up.
Oh my goodness, Michael, thank you so much for your time. This has been so insightful, and I feel like your book really sums up the biggest challenge that I'm having of execution. So excited to read that. I'm really curious when we're talking about this conversation of change and influence. I guess for me, I kind of view change from a different perspective because I kind of grew up in it, and I've always there's just something about the unknown that's fascinating to me, and I kind of go toward it versus away from it. But the demographic that I serve is the 50 plus demographic. So obviously, as people are older, they become set in their ways and change becomes a lot more challenging. What insights, or I guess the better question would be from you personally, how do you kind of process change, and what tips do you have to kind of implement that to influence others?
Yeah, I think, what I found, yeah, we all have biases about how we operate, right? And even us, we've been going 15 years. We're guilty of sometimes getting stuck in our ways and resisting change. And you say, well, this is how it's always been. This is how it's always going to be. This method has always worked. And I think the biggest thing I've learned is not to take suggestions for change and improvement. Firstly, you have to create this space, but not to take it personally and not to get defensive. And I think genuinely take it like if someone's bringing a suggestion for change and we're aligned on the outcomes, this isn't to say, everything we're doing is wrong, but really to interrogate that. And I've seen this again and again, and really embrace the idea that good ideas can come from anywhere, but in order to give power to that, you have to be open to identifying and receiving those ideas. But again, I think a lot of that is also the people bringing suggestions forward and how you go about doing that as well. And there's a whole science involved and art in that. And sometimes I actually saw it on the weekend. I was at this conference in Portugal, and it was encouraging people to think about the sustainability ecosystem in Portugal. And this gentleman got up. He had some incredible ideas about what they could do, but he began by basically saying, I disagree with everything you've just said. And language matters. And someone once said to me, after I had quite a heated call with someone gave me this piece of advice. They said, remember, it's not about winning an argument. It's about how people feel once they left. And I think, again, it comes back to that. Sometimes we have this desire to score points, win an argument, versus how are we leaving people feeling, and that's a big part of this as well. And it's both on both sides. And that's why in the book I start by posing the question, do you want to win an argument? Is this about feeling right, righteous, certain, and safe? Is this about tapping into that dopamine high that comes from scoring points on social media and taking down the others? Or is it about changing the world? Because if it's about changing the world, then it's a very different mindset as well.
Wow, that was powerful. Thank you so much. It's not about points, it's about changing the world. I'll remember that one. Thank you.
Mick, this has been an unbelievable hour, and I cannot even begin to thank you enough. So we're a pretty passionate community of 750 or so people in 34 different countries and growing pretty rapidly. What can we do to be a resource to you, to be a resource to Global Citizen, and help? Obviously, we can find you on social media. Everybody should absolutely buy the book, write a review. But what can we do as a community to be a resource to you?
Yeah, and I should say, because some people have said, is it on Audible as well? Books available on Audible. I must admit, I apparently I wasn't famous enough to narrate my own audiobook yet. But they did find another Australian in New York who did an incredible job and bashed it out in 6 hours. So if Audible's your thing, you can check it out on that. Look, what I would love is people to share their stories with me. One thing, if you're reading the book, if you're consuming content, if you've got stories that resonate, if you've got additional suggestions out there, I would love to hear from you. I'm putting together a bonus chapter. So get in touch with me and I'll put you on the distribution list for that. And I talk about the visionary, I talk about the diplomat, I talk about the implementer, but I know there's some stuff I'm missing, and I know I'm missing some of these insights. And one person gave me the advice that when you publish a book, it's not the end of a conversation, it's the beginning of a conversation. And I'm toying with a few labels for what this bonus chapter will be. And you're the first community I'll reveal that to. I'm toying around with, is it the caregiver? Is it the innovator? Is it the magician? But I feel like there's a few principles beyond the 8 which I'm probably missing. And so I'd love any feedback, what strikes with you, what you find as I work through this, and any other stories of policy entrepreneurship you want to share as well, whether that's in business, the nonprofit, philanthropy, the community, at the citizen level. I would really love to hear that. And of course, if you're in New York, I travel a lot, but would love to hear you. Welcome to our Global Citizen Office. We've got some great events coming up in September as well, and welcome you to the Global Citizen Festival. But yeah, and love to participate in anything you've got going on as well. Like, I genuinely believe that community is the one word, and I don't think I actually said it enough through the book, but someone said it's the unspoken word that really permeates through the pages of the book. No one can do everything at the end of the day, but everyone can do something. And so that's the spirit with which I'm here, and really, really want to thank you all for your active engagement. This has been a great way to start the morning here.
Yeah, this has been so much fun. Enjoy Park City. And you and I will talk very, very soon. But again, cannot thank you enough. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Scott. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Mick.